Salve everyone. Welcome back for video 2. We've got some more in-depth examples of animals in the ancient world, where they were found and what they were used for in the ancient world. So we're very lucky to have Philippus talking us through, and I think he's got a PowerPoint to go through with us.
If we can all see this.
I've got it there. So please, Philippus, take it away.
Good, thank you, Tiberius. And now I want to talk to you a little bit about the different areas in ancient life in which animals were seen and used. Although we have much more evidence for animals in ancient Rome, I thought it would be a shame if we didn't see how beautifully the ancient Greeks could paint their images of animals. So, while Tiberius showed you various mosaics from Ostia Antiqua, so that ancient port in Rome, I'd like to show you some frescoes, which is basically a watercolor painting done on wet plaster on walls and ceilings. And these come from, these frescoes which you see in the PowerPoint come from Knossos, which is on the Greek island of Crete, and it comes from 1500 BC. I personally find the detail and the use of exotic and expensive colors pretty remarkable, especially given that this is over 1,000 years before the Romans did theirs. And what you can notice from these frescoes is that the Greeks really love their color blue, and this color blue is probably a dye, a very expensive dye, which they probably shipped, got imported from the east. And you can see that some monkeys, I think, on the right are colored in blue. We've got some dolphins, which are beautifully and very clearly depicted on the bottom. And I think we've got a stag of some sort, or a bull. I think it's a bull on the top. So that's what the Greeks were able to do in 1500 BC. And now Tiberius will talk to you about the everyday pets.
Yeah, those frescoes were pretty amazing. They did that back then. But now let's turn towards the everyday animals in ancient Rome and Greece, which were their pets. So as you can see, the ancient Romans and Greeks had a strong affection with animals, like we do today, with many kinds, and they tamed and domesticated lots of them and had them as pets. So yeah, exactly, a man's best friend, as Philippus has got up there. A dog was probably the most common dog in the most common animal in ancient Rome. Was probably their favorite pet, and they would I think they were particularly the Maltese breed. That was the breed that they had in the ancients had, but they also had other breeds which were used for guard dog purposes, in the same way that we have today. So there was a particular dog called Argus, which was the pet of Odysseus in ancient times. And I don't think we've gone through the story, Homer's Odyssey, but Odysseus went away from his home and his dog for 20 years. And meanwhile, Argus was home. I think they lived in Ithaca, didn't they? And he had his palace in Ithaca. And the dog waited for 20 years very faithfully for his master, whilst Odysseus was away fighting in the Trojan War. And very sadly, when Odysseus returns, Argus dies, because with the idea being that he's finally seen his master again, and now he can die of old age, because he was obviously a very old dog at that point. But yeah, that's a nice story of how dogs were similarly loved and loyal in ancient times.
Thank you, Tiberius. And if that was sad enough, well, I'm sorry about that. Here's some epitaphs, but I think this is quite moving at the same time. So an epitaph is essentially a tombstone engraving, but usually epitaphs became stuff that authors used in literature, like they would write poems. And these would be addressed by their masters to their dogs, which have died. And we are very, very lucky that archaeologists have been able to unearth these tombstones, which are, as you can see, are still in relatively good condition. Many of these epitaphs contain very moving and personalized messages written to the spirit of the dog that is no longer alive, but the idea being it's been sent on to heaven. For you to get a flavor of their tone and the message, I'll read an example from one. It's not one on the slide, but it's an example of an epitaph. And in English, it reads, "I am in tears while carrying you to your last resting place, as much as I rejoiced when bringing you home in my own hands 15 years ago." So clearly we get an impression of a dog owner who's very distraught with the death of his dog, which he had known for 15 whole years. And if you look at the middle of this tombstone, so the very central one, you can see an engraving, which I'll try and help you to decipher what it means. In the Latin, it's all kind of compressed into one. But if you see little dots, then you can, those dots basically separate the words. So you've got Helenae, and then you've got, that's the first word. Then you've got the second word, alumni. Third word, animae, which is easy to read. Fourth word, incomparabili. Fifth word, et. Sixth word, bene. And seventh word, merenti. So essentially it means to the incomparable, so that's incomparabili, and to the well-deserving soul, that's animae, of Helena, of dear Helena. So the dog, or that might look like a cat. I don't know how you interpret it. But basically it's saying that this cat is the most incomparable. It's the best cat that there is around, and it's well deserving of this tombstone. So these tombstones were pretty incredible because they were almost as lavish as the ones given to humans. And that really shows how much the ancients loved their pets. And I think Tiberius is now going to talk to you about birds.
Yeah, cats and birds. So birds were also popular tamed animals to have in both Rome and Greece. So as examples, I think they would have magpies, crows, and ravens as pets. And they even taught them to speak, which is pretty cool. They also had nightingales and blackbirds who would also be domesticated because they sang such beautiful songs. And even there, I mean, the list goes on. They would have ducks, geese, rabbits, tortoises, goats, and even parrots and monkeys if you were rich enough. But you might be asking, what about the small animals that we have today, like mice and rodents? What do they do about them, and how do they get rid of them? Well, the Greeks often used snakes to keep out the mice, but by the time that the Romans had to deal with them, they used a species that is similar to the cat that we know today, but it came from ancient Egypt in the 1st century AD. And its specific use was a mouse catcher. I think Philippus has got his.
We have got a cat here, but unfortunately the cats in ancient Rome didn't look like this. But I thought I'd just take my cat, and he says hello to you all, and he's probably going to run away now.
Hopefully your cat is a good mouse catcher.
So as Tiberius mentioned, another use of animals was kind of for farming. And that's obviously what most people had to do for a living if they wanted to survive. And so farm animals, the Greeks and Romans often owned kind of plot of land and kept typical farm animals, as Tiberius mentioned, like sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, really for producing meat, milk, eggs. However, less appealingly, they used animal poo, which was really an important fertilizer if you wanted to grow crops, if you wanted to cultivate the land and make the soil more fertile. And bigger animals, known as draft animals or beasts of burden, because they could kind of carry heavy stuff, were used, and they were often used for ploughing. And these were animals such as kind of bulls, oxen, horses, and cattle, as you can see in some of these pictures. Even maybe dogs were used as well. But before the age of automatic ploughing, well, you had to use what you had, and you had to use heavy beasts.
Sorry, I was on mute there. So hunting and extinction. So the ancients were no foreigners to chasing and killing animals for food and also material for clothing. The Greeks generally were much bigger hunters than the Romans. They did it a lot more, and they would typically go on foot with their hunting dogs in pursuit of small animals, maybe hares and other prey. So more adventurous hunting expeditions would be to go after a wild boar, which we looked at in my PowerPoint. If you remember, the Latin for wild boar is ferox aper. But this would require quite a big expedition. You would need a large pack of dogs and men who are armed with javelins and nets, because you definitely wouldn't want to attack a wild boar on your own. That's quite a dangerous thing to do. And yeah, you definitely need stuff and weapons to defend yourself with. But more hunting did mean more risk of extinction, sadly. And by the end of the Roman Empire in about 500 AD, many species sadly went extinct from overhunting and were never seen again. So that's quite a sad aspect of the hunting that was around in the ancient world.
And so another concept I'm going to talk to you about is the venationes. That's the name in Latin, and I translate it as animal battles. And so very sadly, Tiberius told us that certain animals went extinct, and unfortunately, another area in which they went extinct was because humans used them more for entertainment rather than hunting. So just when you thought, ancient Romans and Greeks would have animals as pets and they would hunt them, well, no, they also used them for their own source of fun and entertainment. The Greeks, for example, liked to watch chariot races, but the Romans unfortunately took this to another and a sadder, unfortunately, much sadder level, and they introduced these things, as I said, called venationes, of which the literal meaning is a hunt, but I translate it as an animal battle. And in this slide, we have examples of these contests. And the venationes precisely included watching animals brutally fight against each other or even against men. So as you can imagine, these spectacles became utter bloodbaths where the fighting took place in circuses or arenas, such as the Colosseum. And the Colosseum is the one that you can see in the top left. It's a big stadium, and you can see in the middle. It's almost like a zoo. It's really a breeding ground for animals and men. And animals such as lions, elephants, tigers, boars, and bears, I think even leopards, hippopotamuses, I mean, the list goes on. Even crocodiles can be left in the center of the arena, as you see in the image, to fight trained gladiators. Usually these gladiators would be armed with javelins, and good gladiators would probably come out victorious. But other human fighters who were not gladiators were probably prisoners of war and slaves. And you can imagine that they would have been torn apart by these animals. And very sadly, from our perspective, obviously this seems very, very cruel towards animals and towards humans. But for the Romans, they shockingly saw this as a source of fun. So many people think that these venationes took place in Rome from about 200 BC all the way to 500 AD. It's about 700 years, during which time thousands of animals would have died, actually not least humans, and they would have gone extinct. Bit of ancient history here for some of you. The wealthy emperors would usually pay for these shows to be put on for the entertainment of their public as a way of usually gaining political support so that they might get elected on the second time round. For example, Augustus, who was the very, very first emperor of Rome, boasted that he had put on 26 of these venationes during his reign, in which over 3,000 animals were killed. The mad Emperor Nero, nearly a century later, decided to flood the Colosseum with water, just so that Roman spectators could watch polar bears fighting against seals. So pretty shocking stuff.
So animals were really important in religion in ancient times, and if we go on to the next slide, please, Philippus, they were used in animal sacrifices to please the gods, and this is the Greeks and Romans both did this. They would kill innocent animals and cover it in wine and pour sacred water sometimes roast the animal over a fire. There were many different ways that you could sacrifice the animal and prepare it for the sacrifice to the gods. Um, and there were specific sacrifices that you had to follow depending on which of the Roman or Greek gods you were sacrificing to. So, for example, if you were sacrificing to the goddess Diana, I think we looked at the story of Diana and Actaeon earlier this year, but Diana was the goddess of animals and nature. And so when you sacrificed her, you would sacrifice a dog. But if you were sacrificing to the god Apollo, who was god of war, you would sacrifice a bird. So there were strict rules, and they were very superstitious about these sacrifices, and they had to get them absolutely right in order to make sure that the gods were on their side for when they needed help from the gods. So I think you've got another slide interpreting omens. Yeah, thanks. So whilst animals would be used in the actual sacrifices to tell whether a sacrifice was successful or not, depended on being able to read prophetic omens from the gods. So they would tell you about what the future looks like. And the most famous way that the ancient Greeks and Romans understood these signs were from above, as you can see in these images, how birds were flying in the sky. And interpreters would analyze their formation and see how they were flying in the air. And the prophet could then supposedly tell you if things were going well or if things were going to turn out badly. So yeah, animals did play a really important role in superstition and in the ancient Greeks and Romans idea of what was going to happen in the future.
Thank you, Tiberius. So the very final concept I'd like to talk to you about, and you'll be glad to know, is the role of animals in ancient warfare. And the strongest animals we can imagine would be used to carry equipment for men fighting. But some would actually also be involved in the fighting itself. As you can see from some of these pictures, some of the animals include, well, we got a pigeon at the bottom, in the bottom center. These would typically be used as messengers. You might remember Caesar, probably from your Asterix comics. Caesar used quite a lot of these pigeons as messengers. And you can see on the slide other animals would include like horses. You might have a warrior pig. I know it sounds a bit strange, but I think that's the most bizarre. A warrior pig sounds pretty cool. A warrior boar, you can imagine, because they're so ferocious that they'll probably just tear through the enemy. And even elephants. And elephants is something that I'm going to talk to you about here. You might have heard of this guy called Hannibal. For those of you who haven't or need a bit of reminding, he was a Carthaginian general. Tiberius told you where Carthage was, which is in the northeast of Africa, which you can see about here, if you can see my cursor. And arguably Hannibal was one of the greatest commanders in world history, especially in ancient history. And he was involved in the wars which were fought between Carthage and Rome, the kind of two main empires at the time. And these wars were consisted of 3 wars, which were called the Punic Wars. But don't worry too much about that, because Hannibal only fought in the Second Punic War, which took place from about 218 to 201 BC. So we're kind of in the early stages of Rome's greatness, coming towards its peak. And Hannibal was one of the very first generals to use elephants. Think of elephants in today's sense as military tanks, which would be kind of used to ram through an enemy battle line. And you can obviously see quite a few reasons why these were successful. Here we are. But also quite a few reasons why they might not have been so successful in Hannibal's case. So these animals, obviously, elephants were pretty terrifying from the perspective of an enemy. And what Hannibal had to do was he had to cross he had to cross from Africa to Spain. He was very successful in Spain. He managed to conquer the whole of Spain pretty much and conquer the Roman resistance because the Roman Empire extended all the way to the very tip of Spain. He also got through the south of France. But then you can see from the map, he had to cross the Alps, which is a mountain range in the very connecting Germany, connecting France. but importantly, he had to cross the Alps to get into Italy. And you can imagine when he was crossing the Alps, the weather conditions were very, very, very testing, very cold, very difficult, high altitude. And he got to the other side, but he lost most of his elephants and his army on the way. And by the time he actually reached Rome, which was the city he actually wanted to conquer because it was the center of the Roman Empire, he was really at his weakest. He'd lost most of his men and elephants. So although Hannibal wasn't the most successful military commander that we know in ancient times, the story of him leading his 36, people think it's about 36 elephants over the snow-capped Alps, is still a story which resounds and resonate with us today. So, and that's why so many artists, as you can see from these pictures, have decided to represent Hannibal's crossing over the Alps, because it's for readers, young and old, it's always been a source of mystery, fantasy, and it's been quite an exciting tale.
Yeah, and we've got another exciting tale to finish this second video with today, and that is the geese that saved Rome. So they were also called the Holy Capitoline geese, and this is because in 390 BC, during the Battle of Allia, the Celtic Gauls came all the way from Britain to attack Rome. And when the Romans saw the Gauls, they were terrified by their huge size and barbarian qualities, such that they so much that they ran straight back into their city and forgot to close their gates and huddled into the Capitoline, which was a fort on one of the 7 hills of Rome, because Rome famously had 7 hills. And the Gauls besieged the Romans for 2 days, and on the 3rd night, they managed to find a track which would take them to a back entrance into Rome, which was unsecured. However, when they were climbing the hill and about to climb the walls, some geese who were sacred to Rome's goddess Juno began to squawk and create havoc. And the Romans immediately woke up and did all they could to defend their fort on the Capitoline. And in the end, they won and succeeded in driving away the Gauls. But the moral of the story is that if the geese hadn't given away the enemy, Rome would definitely have been destroyed by the Gauls, and the Latin language might never have come down through the ages to be taught in schools today. And Philippus and I wouldn't even be here to teach you. So yeah.
a bit dramatic, but that's essentially the moral of the story. And I think it's quite a wonderful, these 2 myths of Hannibal. Myths, maybe I think they were history. Sorry, myth is the wrong word to use. They were definitely bits in history, events that happened. But those are, in my opinion, the two best tales that we can take from Roman history. So hopefully now you can see how central the role animals played in the daily lives of ancient Greeks and Romans, and in some ways how they were similar in their own fascination with animals, and how that resembles our own fascination today. We care about pets in much the same way as the ancient Greeks and Romans cared about their pets, and perhaps they had a slightly greater range of pets, but the same morals are true. Obviously, animals in ancient time might not have had the same care and protection as they should have deserved. There was no RSPCA as such, and obviously they treated their animals in some ways pretty brutally. But ultimately, I like to think of the animals of ancient Greece and Rome as the heroes of those 2 main civilizations. And basically, the reason why those civilizations lasted for as long as they did was down to the animals they had, as you can see from some of those tales that we shared with you. Without the animals of ancient times, we might not have been able to know nearly as much as we did about these 2 civilizations. And I think it's such a shame that people, when they study ancient Greek and Rome, overlook the animals. So that's why we want to thank Ionor once again for suggesting this topic. And as you can see, there's a lot which applies to us today, which we can think about. So as you can see from the slide, Tiberius and I would be really interested to see how creative you can get in drawing your own animal scenes from the ancient times. Maybe you might draw a domestic pet, or perhaps you might draw some larger animal to be a rival to Hannibal's terrific elephants. But anyway, whatever you come up with, please do get your parents to send it to us, so we can give you a special shout out in our next video and show your creative drawing. And we certainly look forward to seeing where your imagination can take you. And so it's now time to say goodbye. And we hope to see you in our third video, where we'll be doing some reading on animals on the ancient world. Bye from Tiberius and I.
Thanks, guys, for tuning in.